Omar, you are live. Is it Badar?
It is Badar.
Omar, thank you so much for joining me today. You are a Palestinian-American political analyst, and you're joining us today to talk about Israel's violence and evictions in East Jerusalem that is happening during Ramadan. That's led to a wave of state sanctioned violence from both Israeli forces and Israeli civilians. It has been really traumatic to watch. We've been going over clips. We've been kind of getting a primer on how this started with these unlawful, unjust evictions. But for people who might be joining a little bit late or are unfamiliar, could you give a primer of how we got to this point, like what this root issue is with these evictions, and especially the sensitivity happening during Ramadan?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you. And I think that when we're talking about what is unfolding in Jerusalem, it really is part and parcel of it's really a microcosm of the entire issue in Palestine and Israel. Israel was created at the expense of more than 750,000 Palestinians who were driven out of their homes, and at the expense of more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages that were destroyed. There was a very deliberate effort to carry out ethnic cleansing in order to make space for a Jewish majority state. And really, what's unfolding today is not fundamentally different. I mean, there are a couple of things that are interesting here. One is that this Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, where there's these new efforts to expel Palestinians out of their homes, they are in East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem is universally understood and agreed upon to be occupied Palestinian territory that Israel has no right to. So there's a lot of talk right now. You see a lot of Israeli politicians talking about this being a real estate dispute and wait for the Israeli Supreme Court to weigh in. But really, Israel has no jurisdiction over that area, has no right to it whatsoever. And international law is incredibly clear about the fact that you cannot carry out population transfers in occupied lands. And in this case, it's obviously pushing out occupied people in order to move over a segment of your occupier population to take over their homes. That's a war crime under international law. And it's an effort where, while some Israeli leaders who are more coy and try to be political about it to say that this is a real estate dispute and it's a legal matter, others are much more blunt. The deputy mayor of Jerusalem is very blunt about the fact that Israel has a policy of reducing the number of Palestinians in Jerusalem and increasing the number of Israelis in order to achieve demographic dominance. That's the overt racism with which they speak when it comes to an issue like this. And obviously, even without this specific set of attempted ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, the status quo in Palestine is that Palestinians from the river to the sea throughout Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories live under apartheid, as this most recent Human Rights Watch report that just came out really details, outlines it in quite a good level of detail. And so even without this latest effort, Israel is the initiator of violence. And obviously, when they start expanding and escalating the violence as they have, it's just a recipe for things to get out of hand the way we're witnessing right now.
Right. I think people should remember, like, by definition, an oppressed group of people cannot initiate violence. Like, they are already the recipient of the initiating violence. So I think people need to understand that and see this through that lens. And Netanyahu has already previously espoused a policy. He's trying to further annex the West Bank. I mean, does this feed into that at all? And how do these kind of is there any interplay between what we're seeing now and this long-term regional goal?
Absolutely. Look, I think you put your finger exactly on the issue here when you talk about an occupying power that's on land that does not belong to it, claiming that it's defending itself. The entire concept is laughable. If somebody intruded into your home with a gun, they can't claim self-defense. They're an armed intruder in your home. And that is precisely the status of Israeli forces who are present on Palestinian land. And when it comes to Israel's project of annexation in the West Bank, it's also worth noting that annexation has already been carried out. On the ground, it's a de facto reality that Israel has captured huge parts of the occupied Palestinian territories and built countless settlements on them that make the possibility of Palestinian independence impossible at this point. And whenever they're talking about annexation plans, all they're talking about is officially declaring as a matter of law what is already a matter of reality on the ground. That is the entire issue, is that there is this pretense that Israel's occupation of the West Bank is temporary, but obviously when you look at the extent of Israel's permanent takeover of the Palestinian territories, the roads they built that Palestinians cannot drive on and only Jewish settlers can drive on, the extent of the infrastructure, it really is massive. And to imagine that there would be 250,000 settlers who might leave the West Bank one day to end that occupation just really seems laughable at this point. You know, the entire idea of a two-state solution was based on Israel withdrawing from the occupied Palestinian territories, by the way, which are a mere 22% of historic Palestine, when you talk about just the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, with the idea that then a Palestinian state would exist on those territories. And throughout the so-called peace process, when Israel was pretending to be interested in a two-state solution, all they did instead was expand further and further, taking the Israeli population within the occupied Palestinian territories from a mere 100,000 now all the way up to closing in on 800,000. So any pretense that they were interested in allowing a Palestinian state to exist is obviously now belied by the reality they've created, which is the exact opposite. And, you know, I think the Trump administration created room for Netanyahu to become more blunt and blatant about what he's actually carrying out. And that's why you saw all this talk about formalizing annexation. But that has always been the plan for sure for the Netanyahu government.
Part of that, I would imagine you're referring to, is the U.S.'s recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And then that is continued. That's policy that's continued now by the Biden administration, which is deeply upsetting. And we also saw during the campaign some very strong anti-Palestinian rhetoric on Biden's site that they eventually changed, but you kind of saw their true intentions between that and then also these statements from Blinken and the flimsy justification from the State Department spokesperson, which you probably saw yesterday. They are trying to couch this all in this framework of self-defense for Israel. Did you happen to see that interaction with the State Department spokesperson and the reporter, where he asked, "Okay, well, do the Palestinians have a right to self-defense too?" What's your read on that, and how does that make you feel?
Yeah, look, it's an incredibly pathetic performance, and it's entirely predictable. That's really the problem with American politics when it comes to this issue, is that no administration has had the courage to really be bold enough on this issue. Even President Obama, who clearly understood the situation, he spoke about, gave multiple speeches on the issue of Palestine and Israel, where it was clear that he got what the fundamental problem was, but he was never willing to be bold on it. He was never willing to pay the political price of actually engaging on it in an honest way. And that's really what you see. There's this pretense that Trump was the problem and that, once Trump is gone, everything goes back to normal. But the problem is that the normal that preceded Trump was already a problem. American policy has always been one of paying lip service to the idea of human rights and criticism of Israeli settlements, and the Israeli occupation has to come to an end. But when it comes to U.S. actions, the U.S. action has always been unconditional military aid to Israel, no matter what Israel does, no matter how many rights it violates, and unconditional diplomatic support at the United Nations, where the U.S. has used its veto more than 40 times to shield Israel from accountability at the United Nations. Just to put that in perspective, it's greater than the number of all vetoes cast by all other permanent members of the Security Council combined on all issues for that same period since the 1970s to today. I mean, it really is insane.
Absurd.
And so we have, finally Trump is gone, and all Trump did was resolve this American hypocrisy between policy and actions in the wrong direction. He made sure that American policy positions were every bit as horrible as our actions. And even more so, he really escalated the U.S. position from being merely an enabler of Israel's crimes against Palestinians to becoming a full-on participant into Israel's war on Palestinians. And Biden comes in, and sure, he undoes some of the terrible things that Trump has done. One of the things that I think is really important and commendable is the restoration of American funding of the UN agency that looks after Palestinian refugees. That's important because these are very vulnerable people who depend on that aid. But to really think about it differently, again, you can't help but just be infuriated about the fact that Biden is funding Israel's oppression of Palestinians to the tune of $3.8 billion every year in military funding, and then turns around and tosses a few $1 million on a UN agency to help Palestinians survive the very oppression that he himself is funding. I mean, that contradiction is insane. And that is reflected in The statements that you see right now from the State Department, where they constantly equivocate and speak out of both sides of their mouths when it comes to this issue. When Israel is carrying out massive violence against Palestinians, all the US can bring itself to do is express concern and reservation. And the second there's any kind of violent Palestinian response, suddenly the United States discovers the meaning of the words strong condemnation. And I mean, it's fine, right? Like when some Palestinian faction fires rockets out of Gaza, that should be condemned. It's incredibly stupid and indefensible and counterproductive. But at the same time, the US is funding far greater terrorism that is being carried out by the Israeli government. And if you talk about moral responsibility, you should be speaking up about the violence that you yourself are funding and perpetuating, rather than just the random violence that you see on somebody else's part.
Right. We've seen footage over the past week of the desecration of mosques and holy sites. Again, just unbelievably offensive, especially at any point. Especially some of these are it's just I don't want to say ancient, but they were very old, historic sites of great significance, great religious and spiritual significance. And to do that at any point is offensive. To do that during Ramadan is just insult to injury. And I think about the similarities when we see the outrage, the justified outrage here, when you see the police attacking protesters, and you see the police attacking people who are demonstrating, showing solidarity with people who are attacked by police or killed by police, or even people we saw recently in Los Angeles, a huge outpouring of support for people who are being displaced, who are experiencing homelessness by the police. And what I think people should understand is this unified struggle, and we should show solidarity with Palestinians, in Jerusalem, throughout the region, at the hands of state-sanctioned violence. And these are all interconnected struggles. And when you have people like Andrew Yang who rush out of the gate to condemn Palestinians or some rogue faction and just making unilateral denunciations of Palestine as a result, it completely misses the mark. Obviously, that was widely decried, but celebrated by people like Stephen Miller. Can you talk about how these struggles? Here we have demonstrations and protests against fascist violence and state violence. These are connected. How do these struggles overlap?
Sure. Just before I get to that, I do want to comment on Andrew Yang, who is clearly a shameless panderer when it comes to this. And just honestly, it's almost, cringeworthy on some level, right? Because he's running for office in New York, and he just assumes that this is what a city with a major Jewish population would want to hear. But that misunderstands the fact that we have a significant shift in American Jewish public opinion in the United States. There was a time when AIPAC was the only game in town, and you could carry on with this pretense that somehow AIPAC speaks for the American Jewish community. But that is clearly no longer the case. You have a major organization in J Street that is a centrist organization that, calls itself pro-Israel, but also advocates for Palestinian rights as well. And then you have much more progressive Jewish organizations as well, like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. And their growing role really is demonstrating the fact that there's great diversity within the American Jewish community, and there's significant support for respecting and supporting Palestinian human rights. Honestly, working in the Palestinian rights movement, Jewish allies are just, they're so numerous. Like, it's a huge part of the movement for advancing Palestinian rights. So this idiocy that somebody like Yang carries out, and just, jumping on board and condemning Palestinians and supporting and cheering on Israel's bombing of them, it's ridiculous. And also it's backed by outdated political understandings of public opinion in the US, where now a majority of Democrats favor conditioning American military aid to Israel because of Israel's violations of Palestinian rights. And that's what politicians need to catch up to, is the fact that you have the significant shift. You have increasingly American political figures who are willing to speak up in defense of Palestinian rights. And this mythology that you can never cross AIPAC and survive politically, that's being busted. You had Eliot Engel, who was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most regressive forces in American foreign policy, just a terrible human being all around. And he was backed by AIPAC, and then he was unseated by Jamal Bowman, who was a relative unknown who was speaking up for Palestinian rights when he was still running for office. There is clearly a shift in American public opinion on this issue. The taboo around criticizing Israel has been broken, and it really is just a matter of time before the rest of the Democratic establishment catches on. I think they're beginning to see it, but unfortunately, we're still a far way from getting to where we need to go. But on your question on the interconnectedness of the struggle, that also to me is a really, really promising and upbeat sign, is that even though the situation on the ground for Palestinians is getting worse and worse every single day, the extent of Israel's violence and the overt racism that is directed at them is growing by the minute. And the footage emerging from Palestine is horrifying on a regular basis. But when you look at what's happening here and around the world, you absolutely see an interconnectedness. There is an understanding that oppressed people everywhere have a common cause in shifting and taking on a system that has maintained these different levels of oppression that have existed. And the extent of Palestinian solidarity with the Black Lives Matter struggle here in the United States, with the Jewish American struggle against white supremacy. I mean, just across the board, oppressed people are coming together. They are understanding that the systems of oppression are connected, that the systems of power that hold them down are ultimately one giant global system in some way, not in the literal sense that they're the exact same players, but they all serve a functioning system right now, and a system that has to be uprooted, has to be fundamentally changed from the bottom up. And I think that that's really something that I consider to be very hopeful. And you see it in the expressions of solidarity from Ferguson to Palestine, starting in 2014. And honestly, even before that, with the Jesse Jackson campaign in the 1980s, where,
Coalition.
Palestinians were absolutely a part of that. And it was the first time through that Palestine was mentioned from the Democratic National Convention podium in 1988 by Dr. James Zogby, who was part of the Jesse Jackson campaign. So this is a struggle that goes back, and I think those connections are being made by more and more people.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the angle thing, that was such a significant defeat for pro-Israel, anti-Palestine interests, because I mean they had every power player in the Democratic Party and the Democratic apparatus backing him. I mean, he had a powerful chair seat in the House Foreign Relations Committee. I mean, he was very, very regressive. Ken Klippenstein has talked extensively about how aggressive he was with even like squashing leaks, which obfuscated some of the worst things the U.S. government and the U.S. intel community does around the world. So to be defeated by Jamal Bowman, like you say, he was relative unknown, but who was speaking truth to power, standing in solidarity with Palestinians, was very significant. For one, in showing how progressive challengers can take on power centers and win, but also how groups like If Not Now and other Jewish groups who show solidarity with Palestinians can move the needle on this issue. Like that wasn't really, something that backfired for Bowman as much as Engel and his supporters might have tried. It never really stuck, because people are now seeing through that because of grassroots activism. So I agree entirely. Very, very promising long-term sign there. People can show we have a true interfaith community where people can recognize these common bonds and these common struggles, and show solidarity with one another. That cuts through any sort of divisive NGO or nonprofit lobbying or advocacy otherwise.
Absolutely. And you see it, I mean, really, it's kind of interesting, because the traditional pro-Israel lobby is also noticing this shift as well. And you can see it in multiple things that they're doing. One, when the so-called, there's an organization called the Democratic Majority for Israel. It's sort of the AIPAC, effectively the AIPAC arm targeting the Democratic Party. When they went after Bernie Sanders because they didn't like that he's progressive on the issue of Palestine and he was calling for conditioning military aid to Israel and this and that, they did not mention the issue of Israel related to Bernie Sanders at all. They went after him for being too old. They went after him for all sorts of random different smears that they thought would stick. But they understood that going after him for being progressive on the issue of Palestine was not going to resonate with the broader American population. So that, to me, is a sign, is when your opponents start noticing that they're losing the public discourse battle. And you see it also in how much more aggressive they are getting when it comes to suppressing the right to free speech on the issue of Palestine. That's a very real thing. There was a time when, groups like AIPAC just enjoyed sympathetic media coverage from wall to wall. By the way, media coverage is still a problem. I don't want to pretend that it's not. But there was just simply an absence of Palestinian voices in the public discourse, and that narrative was completely absent, that they never felt they needed to squash their opponent's ability to speak freely. But now we are at a point where public opinion is clear that trends are moving in the right direction. Young people get it, progressives get it, diverse people get it. And as a result, you see two things happening. One, an effort to criminalize the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is targeting Israel. This is an effort in light of the fact that world governments are not holding Israel accountable by conditioning military aid to it on it behaving like a civilized state and respecting Palestinian rights. Now the effort is shifted to people just taking matters into their own hands and carrying out civil society-driven boycotts, divestment, and sanction efforts targeting Israel until Israel recognizes Palestinian rights. That's effectively the demand. And you have bills in so many states and laws that have actually passed that make it punishable by the government to be engaged in a boycott of Israel, which is just absurd. It's such a clear violation of the First Amendment. There's no question about it. There was a town in Texas where in the aftermath of a hurricane, if you wanted to qualify for government relief, you had to sign a waiver saying that you're not boycotting Israel. I mean, it's just the level of absurdity really is out of control. And in a way, because they're getting desperate and they're overreaching, that has opened up space for civil rights giants that probably don't care about Palestine otherwise, like the ACLU weighing in and saying this is a clear violation of free speech and we have to stand up. And this, again, expanded the coalition of people who are concerned about Palestinian human rights in a very inadvertent way. This was completely driven by a need to protect American civil liberties and the right to free expression. And of course, you hear so many people complain about free speech not being respected and cancel culture. And yet, when you have efforts by the government to shut down people's speech, those same voices are hardly heard from at all. But the thing that I think is even more important on that front, that is worth mentioning, is the effort to expand the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. This is really where probably the most contested domestic component of Israel-Palestine policy in the United States comes down to this, which is there was a definition drafted by someone, Ken Stern, who said he drafted it loosely to be very broad as a definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel because it was simply used for data collection abroad. And then the pro-Israel lobby groups in the United States saw this as an opportunity to use it domestically to try to say that if you criticize Israel or if you engage in demonization of Israel or judging Israel by double standards, all these really vague parameters for what constitutes criticism of Israel versus demonization, they saw that as an opportunity to suppress Palestinian speech in the United States. And so they're trying to run with it. And it's amazing because the author of that definition is saying, do not use this domestically. This would undermine the right to free expression. Don't use it. And yet you have all these groups pushing for it, and the Trump administration adopted it, and the Biden administration doesn't seem to have any interest in abandoning that recognition. It's called the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And that can really become a very, very serious problem if we move forward, where every time a student wants to hold a campus event where they're talking about how Israel is an apartheid state or this or that they risk having a lawsuit, basically get into legal trouble and having a civil rights violation complaint filed against them. This will create a chilling effect where we can't organize and speak honestly about what American policy is towards Palestine and Israel. And that's a very, very real threat. And I think that this is the latest tactic that the pro-Israel lobby groups like AIPAC are trying to promote in order to shut down counter speech that they no longer can defeat on merit.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a way more detailed explanation than I could have ever provided, but the current threats to activism and speech. I mean, even in Congress, Ben Cardin, the senator from Maryland, has supported bans on BDS, which is, like you just have pointed out, just a blatant violation of the First Amendment.
And I'll just squeeze one thing on this, by the way. Just when think of somebody like Cuomo in New York, who supported boycotts. I don't remember what state it was, North Carolina or something, over the fact that they had anti-trans and anti-gay legislation, basically, and said we boycott the state. But when it comes to Israel, it said no, a boycott of Israel would not be acceptable. That's anti-Semitic. We can't have it. And it's interesting to reflect on the fact that you can boycott American states, and that's okay, to protest their bad policies, and they are bad policies. But you can't protest the bad policies of a foreign government that is carrying out ethnic cleansing and war crimes with our money. That's where the line has to be drawn. And that's just such a ridiculous double standard when it comes to many people who are stuck in an old mindset when it comes to how you can talk about Israel in the United States.
Right. And you also mentioned like threats to campus activism. There are groups like, what's it called? I think it's called Canary Mission, that just seeks out student activists and just creates like dossiers on them and publishes them, borderline doxing them, and just directs like tons of smear campaigns at students, just kids who were, recognizing an international struggle, a global call for solidarity, and blatant, like you say, war crimes and ethnic cleansing. They want to speak out about this. They want to act. They want to organize on their campus. That's great. We should celebrate that. But you have groups like this that seek them out, try to destroy them and smear them, and it's really, really repugnant. And ultimately, has a chilling effect on speech. This is really alarming. And when you have, there's also been incidents where Zoom, the software that we're using right now to talk, has shut down conversations about Palestine. That's very, very alarming. We talked earlier about how they were social media platforms were censoring activists just these past couple weeks who were speaking out about what's happening in Jerusalem. But that you would have a company that provides video conferencing software shutting down conversations on the basis of speech is very alarming, and we should understand the long-term effects of having tech companies like that having the ability to shut down specific topics. That's extremely alarming.
It is incredibly alarming. And in the case of the last few weeks with everything that is unfolding in Jerusalem right now, I literally heard from dozens of people who are posting about what's happening there and the fact that their social media posts were taken down. And, Instagram is an arm of Facebook. And in the case of Facebook, they have an oversight board that decides what can be posted and what can't be, and essentially a censorship board. And they have somebody on it who used to work at the Israeli government whose job was to flag these things from the other end of this, which is when the Israeli government reaches out to Facebook and demands that Palestinian speech be taken down because they think it incites violence or whatever. And obviously what happens here is that things that are legitimately anti-Semitic get conflated with things that are perfectly protected speech. And that's the same tactic that the Canary Mission uses. Like if you go on the Canary Mission, you see some statements that they highlight from random students are really troubling and are indefensible. But that's all mixed in with the statements of other students who are merely protesting Israel's violations of Palestinian human rights. And that just all gets mixed together. And it really is a deep problem that you have tech companies who are so reflexively deferential to requests from the American government or from the Israeli government about what speech is allowed and what is not, instead of having real robust policies that they can assess individually and respond to. There have been public articles written multiple times about whether Facebook was going to consider that the word Zionist in particular contexts can be considered code for Jewish, and therefore could legitimate some action against it. And that's just really opening the door to a level of censorship that really would be horrifying. It's definitely a deep problem. It's ongoing. People who are outspoken on this particular issue, just the irony of saying the canary in the coal mine, but we really are, in a way, constantly on the front lines of efforts to suppress free speech. And if we allow it to happen to people who are speaking up in defense of Palestinian rights, then you're opening the door for it to happen to everybody else. There has to be an understanding that you can't take somebody's free speech rights away without threatening it for absolutely everybody else. So everyone should be invested in making sure that we all get our constitutionally protected right to speak our minds and to deal with the legitimately complex issue of how private social media companies weigh in on this stuff. They're technically not an arm of the government, so the First Amendment does not technically apply, but they're increasingly functioning like public utilities and are the primary forum through which the exchange of ideas in society happens. And that I think is a complicated issue to grapple with. But certainly there are glaring violations of free speech when it comes to that on this particular issue that people should be paying attention to.
Absolutely. Omar, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but is there anything else you want to add that we might have missed or not talked about that people should know or understand?
Look, the only thing I'll say in closing is this is the issue of American policy towards Palestine and Israel is really a stain on our moral conscience. The fact that we are overtly supporting apartheid and the fact that we're doing it to an unprecedented level in American foreign military aid to the $38 billion over a period of 10 years, that comes down to more than $400,000 every hour of our tax dollars being used to fund war crimes at a time when our infrastructure is in shambles and our healthcare system is barely functioning. It's just such a clear-cut case of us doing morally the wrong thing. And I think that every American has a moral responsibility to demand a change in American policy. And while things are changing, and while we do have now people signing on to the McCollum bill, the Betty McCollum bill in defense of Palestinian rights that is insisting that Americans money not be spent on violating Palestinian rights. We need that process to accelerate so that we can end our participation, because every day that this goes on is another day where Palestinians are being oppressed, where another children might be bombed, where another person might be thrown out of their home. And there really is a moral urgency to take action and demand something better from our government on this.
Absolutely. Omar, this was great. It was super informative. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
I really appreciate you. Yep.
Oh yeah, of course, of course. I'm glad you were here. Where can people find you and your work?
You can easily find me on Twitter. Is probably the easiest place, just at Omar Baddar. It's my name. And on there should be a link to my YouTube channel where there's a lot more videos as well. And I'll also encourage people to follow the IMEU. That's the Institute for Middle East Understanding. They're available on every social media platform, and they provide just absolutely incredibly useful and informative content on Israel and Palestine and US policy towards it.
Awesome. Omar, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course.